What makes Metroid good? The Metroid series has always been one that amazes me, and not just because they're an amazing group of games, but because, at least for me, the way these games are designed never sounds like it should work. I mean, think about it, how could a game combine aspects from both Mario and Zelda? How could a 2D platformer also be in an open world without feeling like some sort of giant ant farm? And then, how could that same 2D platformer transition to a first-person shooter without losing any of its design concepts? I guess because it's hard for me to imagine how these games work is why they astound me so much whenever I play them. And I guess that's why I wanted to find out how the mechanics of these games come together to make them great. Before we get any further, I want to preface this by saying that this video was originally going to only be about Super Metroid, but as I was writing it, I realized that most of what I was saying could be applied to the whole Metroid series. So I decided to make this video as a sort of primer for the series as a whole, to discuss and explain some of the reoccurring design themes and ideas of the series, so if I do make any videos in the future about specific Metroid titles, I can focus on talking about them instead of the series. So the first thing that I think makes Metroid good is probably the most prominent design theme in all of the games, and is also probably at this point what the series is most famous for, its massive focus on exploration. Every Metroid game has you exploring a massive non-linear world, filled to the brim with unique areas to visit, enemies to encounter, items to collect, and secrets to discover. Exploring these massive non-linear worlds is what a lot of people, including me, love about these games. And I think a big part about why the exploration in Metroid is great is the way in which those worlds are built. The open world is something that Metroid borrows from The Legend of Zelda, but there's an important difference between how the world of Zelda is designed and how Metroid's is. In Metroid, there's no distinction between dungeon and overworld like there is in Zelda. You see, Zelda's world could be split into two parts, the overworlds and the dungeons. The overworld is what the player will constantly be moving through and revisiting, so it's a bit more sparse on enemies as to not aggravate the player, and the dungeons are typically something the player will only have to go through once, so they can afford to be a bit more of a challenge. You see, this way the game can have its cake and eat it too. It can be a lighthearted adventure, but also a test of skill, and it won't wear on the player too much. But Metroid doesn't have that distinction. The whole world is essentially one big map, and there's very few areas that the player won't return to. And this works very well in Metroid because it immerses the player way more, because now the game is built more like a real world and not like a video game. But making a world like this does create a challenge for the ones designing it. If you make it so the dungeons and the overworlds are one and the same, and the world map is fairly large, the player might run into a situation where they have to backtrack long distances, and then they become annoyed and frustrated. So, to avoid this problem, how do you make it so a world is still expansive, but also quick and easy to travel through? There are a lot of different ways you could go about solving this problem, and the individual games within the Metroid series do deal with it in slightly different ways. You could make it so that shortcuts open up that circumvent certain areas, or give the player new abilities that let them traverse the areas faster, or make it so that the player naturally powers up over time so that areas no longer pose a threat to them so they can just run right through them. But the most common way the Metroid games deal with this issue is probably the most simplest, but the most effective. It's how it structures its levels. Look at the map of Super Metroid. Notice that the areas are pretty compact and don't sprawl out too much. Most of them have an almost rectangular shape to them, and you might not think too much of it, but I think that the compact levels are a big reason why the exploration in Metroid works so well. By making the areas as compact as possible, you minimize the distance a player has to travel to get through them. You still have a large area, but a small perimeter. So now the player can get from one point on the map to the other fairly quickly. The game's title even makes note of this fact. The Metro in Metroid comes from the developers noting how quickly the player can traverse, and compared it to how a city's metro system worked. The next part of Metroid that's great is the level design, and I know it might be weird for me to say that about an entire series, but at this point it's pretty much a staple of the franchise that all of the games have an amazing amount of design and thought put into each of its areas. And a really great design element that almost all the games have in common is how the Metroid games are able to use their levels to non-verbally convey information to the player. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. In the original Metroid, the very first item you get is the Morph Ball, an item that's primary use is getting through tight spaces. To get to it, the player has to jump over this wall and then fall down. But after the player gets the Morph Ball, they are unable to jump back out the way they came in, and they have to use their new ability to go under it. Now this might not seem like all that much, but it's actually how Metroid teaches the player how to use their new ability. When the player realizes they can't get out the way they came in, they'll figure out that they have to go under this tunnel, and that they'll probably have to use their new ability to get through it. And since it's lower than they are, the first thing they'll think to do is to press down on the D-pad. It teaches the player the controls, but more importantly, it shows the player in what context they are supposed to use the ability, so that the player can recognize it in the future, and it does all this without telling the player anything verbally. And this technique is so effective that pretty much every game in the series uses it, so whenever the player finds a new ability, there will almost always be in that same room or the very next room an obstacle that will require the player to use their new ability to get past it. Metroid using its environments like this to teach the player how to play the game is a far more organic solution than if they had just made the player go through a tutorial section or had some sort of text prompt that explained what they had to do. The player is still fully informed and they never feel like they don't know what they have to do, but the player is also still fully immersed because they haven't been taken out of the experience by being reminded that they are just playing a game. Metroid is even able to use its environments to convey more abstract ideas through their design. Almost every 2D Metroid starts in a very similar room that establishes a pretty important concept. When the player starts, they can either choose to move to the right or to the left. Now, before I go any further, I want to ask you, in which direction would you go in a typical platformer? To the right, right? Well, Metroid is not a typical platformer, and this is how it shows that to the player, because if they go to the right, they'll hit a wall, so in order to make any progress, the player has to go to the left. This is how the game subtly lets the player know that this is a different game from most platformers, and that they're going to have to approach problems differently than they would in other games. It's a great way to subtly establish these concepts and get the player in the right mindset to play the game. I think the game that does this sequence the best is the original Metroid. Remember the Morph Ball? Well, the player finds it in the first room of the game by going to the left. But the player can actually go to the right quite a bit. In fact, it's the direction they will need to go in order to progress further in the game after they get the Morph Ball. However, if the player goes to the right before getting the Morph Ball, they'll eventually hit this wall that requires them to use the Morph Ball to go under it. So now, in order to make any progress, the player will have to go back to the beginning, go to the left, get the Morph Ball, and bring it back to the wall so they can use it to go under it. The reason I say this sequence is really great is because it's able to summarize the entire gameplay of Metroid within the first few minutes of the game. The player explores their environment and finds an obstacle that they don't have the ability to get past yet, and they have to explore the area some more and might even have to backtrack in order to find the item that will let them past it. Then they head back to the obstacle, use their new ability to get past it, and progress to the rest of the game. The idea of finding new abilities that let you make progress where you couldn't before is one of the core gameplay concepts of the Metroid series, and the first Metroid game is able to get the player to understand that concept within the first few minutes of the game without actually saying anything verbally to the player. The last thing that I think makes Metroid good is, in my opinion, a pretty defining part of the series, but it's probably something that many might not notice, and it's the atmosphere that these games are able to create. The Metroid games have an incredible amount of atmosphere, and it's how they immerse the player in the game, and what stands out even more is that these games have a noticeably darker tone when compared to most other Nintendo games. The events of these games are darker and a bit more adult, and at times it feels like the games are presenting themselves more as a horror game that's intentionally trying to frighten the player. The atmosphere of these games is what sets them apart from most other franchises, and it makes the experience of playing them that much more memorable, and it's amazing that Metroid is even able to create such an atmosphere, since for the most part the series is largely non-verbal. So in order to create its atmosphere and to set its tone, Metroid has to make use of things like its gorgeously detailed environments that give the individual areas a unique feeling of life to them and makes the player feel like they are in a real world. Or its amazing music that does an astounding job of setting the tone and making the player feel the correct emotions, whether it be with triumphant hero music that makes the player feel like they can do anything, or eerie ambiance that makes the player cautious of whatever lies ahead, or intense music that lets the player know they are in a really dangerous situation, or its stunning creature design that makes every enemy seem threatening and makes them all memorable to the player. And at times it even uses how its levels are built to create its atmosphere. Its cramped hallways and tunnels can make the player feel claustrophobic, or it can open up and let the player feel how massive the world really is and how alone they really are in it. A good example of how all these elements come together to create the atmosphere and how varied that atmosphere can be is Phendrana Drifts for Metroid Prime. The first part of this area is an Arctic tundra that's very open compared to the rest of the game. It has a lot of wide space and open sky, and it's also brighter than a lot of other areas, partly because of the sunlight, but mostly because of the white snow the area is covered in. Its music is calm and quiet, and at times it's barely more than ambiance that really impresses on the player how quiet and isolated this place is. And aside from a few hostile species, the wildlife in this area doesn't pose that much of a threat to the player, and mostly just ignores them. All these elements combine to give this place a very tranquil atmosphere. It makes the player feel alone, but it doesn't concern them about it, and instead, it makes them feel like they're a real Arctic explorer, going to places that nobody else has gone before, and discovering all these amazing sights, and it's even more special because they are alone. Now contrast this to another part of this area, which is a space pirate base. This area is very dark, and it only gets darker. The space you have to move in is very confined, and when the music isn't on high alert action, it's unnerving ambiance that just puts the player on edge. And the enemies here are all extremely hostile and very dangerous, especially because the player will usually be fighting multiple at a time, and this is also where the eponymous Metroids are introduced, which are also very dangerous because the player doesn't have an effective means of fighting them just yet. All of the elements of this area combine to give it a very threatening and intimidating atmosphere. The player still feels all alone, but now it's because they are the only thing not trying to kill them. It's a very different feeling from the area just before, and it's really interesting to see how a game can use the same techniques but get drastically different outcomes. It's also really neat to see how they both play with the idea of isolation to different effects. One area uses it to fill the player with a sense of awe and wonderment, and the other uses it to seriously frighten the player. So just by using its environments, there are a lot of different ways in which Metroid is able to create its atmosphere, but I think the best way that Metroid is able to create its atmosphere and set its tone is through its story, and not necessarily the contents of that story, but how that story is told, and how the events of the games play out. All throughout the Metroid series, there are a lot of little moments and sequences in the game that really work well to establish the tone and enrich the atmosphere that much more. The best example of this comes from, again, the beginning of the game, because, again, a lot of the games start in a very similar way. Super, Fusion, Prime 1 and 2, and to be fair, Other M, all start with Samus getting some sort of distress signal, that there's been an attack, or an accident, or some other incident, and people need her help. When she arrives on the scene, the whole place is usually torn apart, and everybody's already dead, leaving behind very little clues as to what happened. The player is completely alone during this section, there's not even any enemies, and it's just them wandering around trying to figure out what happened. Until something happens. The player either picks up an item, or activates an object, or encounters an enemy, and suddenly the whole place just springs to life, and there are enemies coming out of the walls to attack the player, and the main action of the game begins. This sequence is a really great tone setter. In fact, it's so effective that Super Metroid does it twice in a row. It does a really good job at giving the game a sense of mystery to it. The player doesn't know what happened and information is sparsely given to them, and because of that, they are engaged in what's happening and want to keep playing to find out more. It also does an excellent job at making the enemies feel like a threat. By holding off on showing them as long as possible, it makes it so when they do make an appearance, it has some impact and a sense of danger to it. It's kind of like how in a horror film like Aliens, they would try and show the monster as little as possible to make the monster that much more threatening. Now I know it's no secret that the Metroid games were heavily inspired by the Alien movies and share a lot of similarities with the films. They both have a sci-fi space setting, female leads, a hostile alien species that threatens the peace of the galaxy, and Ridley. But I think that Alien's influence on Metroid goes a bit further beyond things like that. When I first played Metroid Fusion, it gave me the same feeling I got as when I watched Alien for the first time. That feeling of being totally alone in a hostile environment, millions of miles from anybody that could help. That tension of being trapped with something really dangerous, something that was watching you, hunting you, and could appear at any time. And I think a lot of the Metroid games, whether deliberately or not, to various degrees, echoes Alien tonally and atmospherically. Now, I wouldn't go as far as to put the Metroid series in the horror genre, but there is a definite element to the series that can make the player fearful. And it's hard to put that element into words, but the best way I can describe it is that it's the unknown. Look at this guy. We find him dead and outside of Kraid's lair in Super Metroid. He has armor like you do, and he's dead, but other than that, we don't know much about him. We don't know who he was, or where he came from, or even how he died. It could be assumed that he was horribly mauled to death by Kraid, but the game doesn't tell us that, and it's actually much more terrifying that way. I mean, what if it did tell us that and we just found out that he tripped and broke his neck? It wouldn't have the same effect at all. By not telling us, the player's imagination runs wild and imagines the most terrifying possibility for them. Along with the feeling of isolation, the sense of mystery and not knowing is a big part of the atmosphere in Metroid. There's the mystery of figuring out what happened to Chozo, or what stuff like Phazon or the X-Parasites are, the tension of not knowing when something like the SAX or a Chozo ghost or a space pirate will suddenly appear and attack you, and the reason the exploration is so exciting and thrilling is because you don't know what's out there and there's the potential for you to find anything, but it's not the potential that makes Metroid amazing, it's the fact that it lives up to it. I'll say it again, that Metroid is an amazing series, and there are a lot of people who consider a few of its games to be some of the best games ever. It's one of the oldest video game franchises, it had its 30th anniversary this year, but sadly it hasn't been given all that much attention in recent history. Its only release in about 5 years has been a spin-off game to a spin-off series. But I still love this series, and I guess I made this video just to say why. I'm still hopeful for and willing to support any future releases in the series, and hey, who knows, maybe we have yet to see the best Metroid game. Thanks for watching, and thanks for playing.